Mercy General in Portland smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights hum over linoleum floors where Natalie Hayes has worked for 3 years, blending into the background of the ICU like the machine she tends. She wears scrubs 2 sizes too large, keeps her hair pulled back tight enough to see the scar tissue along her left temple, and has a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining that she touches unconsciously during shift changes. The patch is the only thing she owns from before. Her hands are steady but scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that have held things together in ways most people never imagine. During morning rounds on a Tuesday in March, she catches a post-op bleed before the monitor's alarm. The patient, a 64-year-old former plumber with 3 grandchildren, is draining too fast through the chest tube. Natalie reads the color, the flow rate, the way his oxygen saturation is trending, and her assessment happens so quickly the residents don't notice she's done it. She moves without asking permission. She adjusts the bed angle. She calls for the attending. By the time Dr. Hargrove enters the unit with his white coat pristine and his presence like a tank idling in a garage, the hemorrhage is contained. She steps back. She says nothing. She becomes invisible again. Hargrove watches from the hallway with narrowed eyes. He's been chief of surgery for 8 years, and his reputation is built on hierarchies, clear lines of authority, rigid protocols, residents who fear him enough to follow orders without question. Competence from below, especially from someone without credentials he recognizes, threatens the entire structure he's spent a decade maintaining. He notices Natalie's hands moving with surgical precision. He notices the way patients calm when she enters a room. He notices she doesn't look at him when she speaks. Good. Uncertainty is easier to manage than confidence. The break room at noon smells like microwaved fish and the desperate hope of 6 people trying to eat lunch in 12 minutes. Natalie sits in the corner by the window, watching rain hammer the parking lot below. Jennifer, one of the younger nurses, sits across from her with a salad that looks like it came from the cafeteria 3 days ago. "You ever talk about where you worked before here?" Jennifer asks. Natalie doesn't look up. "Just around." "Around where?" "Like, California?" "Another state." "Around." Jennifer waits for more. Nurses are trained to ask follow-up questions. Natalie is trained to give nothing. The silence between them stretches like a held breath, and Jennifer eventually gives up. She talks about her apartment instead, her new dog, her boyfriend who works in IT and keeps trying to fix things that don't need fixing. Natalie nods at appropriate intervals. She finishes her coffee in small sips. At 12:44, her phone buzzes. A text from Marcus Jr., her 17-year-old son. "Hey Mom, what's for dinner?" Captain Webb says he's probably swinging by Portland next month. "Can we grab something?" She types back, "Chicken." Sounds good. She doesn't mention the VA hospital appointment next week. She doesn't mention the insomnia, or the way crowds make her nervous, or the fact that she sometimes can't remember the names of people she's worked with for 2 years. Her son knows she was in the Navy. He doesn't know which Navy, which theater, which kinds of operations don't get declassified for another 40 years. He thinks she was a regular nurse, a medic, sure, but the kind that stays on base. The kind that goes home at a reasonable hour. The shift ends at 8 p.m. Natalie clocks out, changes in the locker room, and pulls on her civilian jacket, a worn Carhartt that's too short in the sleeves. She touches the unit patch inside the lining, the stitching rough under her fingertips. The hospital has a gift shop cafeteria where staff eat between shifts, all fluorescent lighting and the kind of food that tastes like regret. It's 8:15 when Dr. Hargrove enters with his entourage, for residents, 2 medical students, all of them arranged in a precise hierarchy around him like planets orbiting a sun that thinks very highly of itself. Natalie is getting her dinner, grilled chicken sandwich, side salad, iced tea. She's standing in line behind a chaplain and 2 phlebotomists. She's thinking about nothing, which is the only way to survive a 12-hour shift in an ICU. She's thinking about the post-op patient whose bleeding she caught, hoping he makes it to his grandchildren's graduation in June. She's thinking about the taste of coffee that isn't burnt. She's definitely not thinking about Dr. Hargrove. He cuts through the line. He does this 3 times a week. The line is a suggestion for people like her, not a rule that applies to him. He's telling his residents about a surgery he performed in 1998, something involving a complicated vascular reconstruction that probably happened and probably doesn't matter anymore. His voice carries the kind of certainty that comes from never having been wrong, or at least never having admitted it. "You're in my way," Natalie says. Polite. Quiet. The kind of thing you say to a person, not to someone you're acknowledging as a person. She's 6 inches from his shoulder. Hargrove turns. He's 48, tan from a ski trip to Aspen, and has the kind of jawline that could cut glass. He looks at her the way a chef looks at a potato, a basic ingredient, necessary but not remarkable. His eyes don't focus. She's not the kind of person he focuses on. "You could say excuse me," he says. "I just did." He smiles, not a real smile, but the kind a predator makes right before it tests whether something is worth attacking. He reaches over her shoulder, his hand brushing her tray, and, deliberately, with enough precision that there's no question it's intentional, he knocks the tray to the floor. The sandwich lands first, the plate shattering into 4 pieces. The tea spreads like a dark stain across the tile. The salad container pops open, lettuce scattering toward the refrigerated section. His residents laugh. Both of them. It's the sound of people who've learned that fear and cruelty are the same currency in Hargrove's department. The room goes quiet. Not the quiet of someone gasping. The quiet of witnesses deciding whether they're safe to move. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. A ventilator wheels somewhere in the distance. The cashier at the register stops scanning items. Natalie looks at the tray on the floor. She looks at the tea spreading across linoleum she mopped when she was 19 in Jacksonville. She looks at her chicken sandwich, which is now a casualty. She looks at Hargrove's face, waiting for his reaction to her reaction, wanting to see her fold, wanting to see her apologize or cry or retreat. That's what usually happens. People fold. People apologize. She takes one measured breath. She lets a single tear escape, not from sadness, but from something older, something that moved through Kandahar like heat waves off asphalt and learned to recognize the moment right before everything goes wrong. She wipes it away without breaking eye contact. Without looking away from Hargrove's face, where the smile is starting to falter because she's not following the script. "I've been shot at by people more impressive than you, Doctor," she says. Her voice is so quiet that only Hargrove and his residents hear it. The tea is still spreading. The room hasn't exhaled yet. She bends down and begins picking up the pieces of plate, carefully, because she's been trained to be careful with sharp objects, and she walks to the trash without saying another word. Without apologizing. Without breaking. The residents are staring at Hargrove, and Hargrove is staring at Natalie, and Natalie is staring at nothing because she's learned how to turn her eyes into windows that show no one home. That was the moment Hargrove decided. The moment he looked at a quiet nurse with scarred hands and faded unit patches and made a bet with himself that he could break her. That he could prove, to himself and his entire department, that competence without authority is just another form of weakness. That's when the real nightmare began. The chart felt light in Natalie's hands as she pulled it from the patient's folder, too light for something that mattered so much. Room for 12, post-operative day 2, Jackson Chen, 56, admitted for an exploratory laparotomy. Hargrove had cleared him for discharge that morning. The drain output told a different story. 240 milliliters in the past 6 hours. Cherry red. Fresh bleeding, not old. Natalie had seen enough surgical complications in her previous life, 3 tours through Kandahar's forward surgical teams, holding intestines and plasma bags and dying men's hands, to recognize what the numbers meant. Internal bleed. Possible anastomotic leak. The discharge order was wrong. She waited for Dr. Hargrove during morning rounds. Waited for him to finish his theater, his performance for the residents and med students who orbited him like planets around a dying sun. He walked through the sixth-floor corridor with his white coat billowing like a cape, his chief resident trailing 2 steps behind with a tablet, nodding at things Hargrove hadn't even said yet. The residents moved faster when Hargrove approached. The nurses looked away. Natalie stepped into his path. Not blocking. Just present. Just professional. The chart extended like a white flag. Dr. Hargrove, I need you to review the drain output for 412 before discharge. The numbers don't support. He didn't read it. Didn't even glance at the paper in her hands. Instead, his eyes moved down to her name badge, then back to her face with something like amusement. His jaw worked, that small muscle under his ear tensing and releasing. The residents slowed their pace, sensing something. The hallway's fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead. Nursing school hunches. His voice carried. Every word aimed at an audience he'd gathered with nothing but his tone. That's what we're doing now? Running our discharge decisions past the floor nurses. The output is 240 in 6 hours, doctor. That's... He took the chart from her hands. Not gently. His fingers closed around it and pulled, the paper crinkling in his grip. For a moment, Natalie thought he might actually read it. Instead, he held it at arm's length, looked at it like it was something a patient had coughed up, and hurled it downward. The pages scattered across the tile floor like wounded birds. One caught the edge of a cart. Another slid under the medication dispensary. The rest just fell, settling in the chaos of everyday hospital traffic. Hargrove's chief resident made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp. The med students froze, watching to see what Natalie would do. Pick that up, sweetheart. Hargrove's voice had dropped an octave, become something like a purr. And next time, don't waste my time with nursing school hunches. You're a good nurse. Competent. But you're not a doctor. Know the difference. He walked past her. His residents flowed behind him like water following a current, their eyes darting between Natalie and the scattered chart as if they couldn't quite believe what they'd witnessed. One of the med students, a young woman, maybe 3rd year, looked like she wanted to stop and help gather the pages. Her resident grabbed her elbow and pulled her forward. Natalie's hands were steady. That was the first thing she noticed. Not shaking. Not trembling. Steady as they had been in the surgical tent in Kandahar when the blast came through the wall and the lights went out and she was working by headlamp on a 19-year-old's femoral artery with rounds still impacting the metal roof. Steady hands. Clear mind. That's what kept people alive. One tear came anyway. Just one. Unprofessional. Unexpected. It formed at the corner of her left eye and traced a path down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture so automatic, so practiced, that she'd done it 1,000 times in the dark. In the cold. In rooms where crying was a luxury that got you killed. She knelt. Started gathering the pages. Room 412's chart. His vital signs. The drain numbers that meant something was wrong inside him. The med student who'd hesitated, her name tag said Chen, MD candidate, came back 5 steps and crouched beside Natalie without being asked. That was insane, the med student whispered. He can't talk to you like that. It's fine, Natalie said. And meant it. This was nothing. This was a man in a white coat playing king on a 6th floor that would forget his name in 5 years. She'd had insurgents point weapons at her. She'd held a corpsman whose legs ended at the knees. She'd written letters home for men who couldn't move their hands anymore. I've cleaned up worse, doctor. The words came out quiet. The med student looked confused until Natalie smiled, small, genuine, the smile of someone who'd survived much heavier things than a scattered chart. Just an expression. But that wasn't true, and the med student knew it. She gathered the rest of the pages in silence and handed them back to Natalie with something like awe in her eyes. Natalie waited until she was back at the nurse's station before reading what Hargrove had done. He'd written a note in the discharge summary. attended by competent floor staff. No concerns noted. And below that, in the margins, in handwriting that looked like it had been pressed into the paper with a pen, 2 words, handled appropriately. The subtext was clear. He was documenting that he'd made his point. That she'd been put in her place. That her professional opinion meant so little it could be scattered across a hallway and left for someone else to gather. What they didn't know was that she'd already started cataloguing his moves like tactical intelligence. The way he wielded authority like a weapon. The way he built his power structure, residents who were terrified of him, attending physicians who owed him favors, a network of small loyalties that cascaded downward. The way he'd chosen to humiliate her in front of witnesses. That last part was important. In a hospital with litigation exposure, public humiliation created documentation. It created witnesses. It created a narrative that, if she chose to escalate, would be defended by everyone present. He'd made a mistake. Not in his actions. In his assumption about who he was humiliating. 2 days later, Natalie brought another chart. This one to the OR. Room for 12, Jackson Chen, had spiked a fever overnight. 99.8, 0.9, 100.2. His abdomen was distended. He was septic. Somewhere inside him, where Hargrove surgery had disconnected and reconnected tissue, something was leaking. Something was dying. The CT scan was pending, but the clinical picture was screaming. She printed the labs herself. Drew the chart from the system. Made sure every number was there. Drain output totals. WBC count at 17,000. Lactate climbing. The unmistakable signature of a surgical complication that needed a surgeon. Hargrove was scrubbing out of an elective hernia repair when she found him. The surgical scrub room had that particular smell, the medicinal sharpness of surgical soap mixed with the ozone after lightning scent of sterilization vapor. His hands were raw from pre-op scrubbing, small cuts visible where the rough brush had worked. He was drying them on a sterile towel when he saw her reflection in the mirror. "Dr. Hargrove, I need you to review Chen's labs before you leave." His clinical presentation suggests. He didn't turn around. He just stopped moving, the towel frozen midway between his hands. Natalie had time to register the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing shifted. He was fast. She'd give him that. Most men didn't move that fast. He crumpled the towel, dropped it into the hazard bin, and turned around with something in his eyes that was almost respect. Almost. "You again." He pulled on his white coat without buttoning it, let it hang open like a cape. The dedicated floor nurse. The one who cares so deeply about her patients. The one who watches the numbers, doctor. His drain output is. He took the chart from her hands the same way he had before. This time, he read it. His eye scanned the page, quick, efficient, a man who actually knew medicine when he was paying attention. She watched his jaw work. Watched the moment he understood. Watched him choose what to do with that understanding. He tore the chart in half. The sound of ripping paper was sharp, almost violent. Then in half again. The pages fell like snow, settling on the surgical floor where someone would sweep them up later. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was different now. Colder. The veneer of theatrical cruelty had fallen away, replaced by something much more dangerous. The voice of a man who'd just realized he was being challenged. "And next time, don't waste my time with nursing school hunches." Natalie took one measured breath. Not because she was afraid, but because what came next had to be delivered with the precision of someone who'd calculated every word. She let a single tear escape, deliberate, controlled, the kind of tear that looked like submission but was actually performance. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "I've been shot at by people more impressive than you, doctor." The hallway went silent. The sound of surgical suction from the OR behind them seemed to get louder. Hargrove's face went through 3 colors, red, then white, then something in between. His chief resident, who'd emerged from the OR just in time to witness everything, took a step backward. "You're done," Hargrove said quietly. "Finished. I'm making a note of this. Insubordination. Undermining physician authority. You'll be in my office tomorrow morning with the hospital administrator. We're going to talk about your future here at Mercy General." Natalie knelt and gathered the torn pieces of the chart. Each scrap was a small weight in her hands. She'd just made a choice. She'd just painted a target on herself. And she'd done it with one sentence that nobody in that hallway would forget. The mask was starting to slip. She could feel it, the weight of 3 years of silence, of docility, of playing smaller than her own competence. One sentence and the naval officer had surfaced, just for a moment. One sentence and she'd become someone that Hargrove could actually see. That night, sitting in her car in the parking garage at Mercy General, Natalie pressed her hand against the small lump of her jacket, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining 3 years ago, the last physical piece of her old life. The emblem was rough under her fingertips. Worn. A reminder of what she'd survived in Kandahar. A reminder of who she actually was beneath the scrubs and the deference and the single tears she'd learned to deploy like weapons. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that no one else knew he was dying. Captain Marcus Webb arrived at Mercy General on a Tuesday morning, admitted through the ER with a piece of shrapnel lodged near his cardiac silhouette, a fragment from an IED explosion outside Kandahar 3 years ago that had somehow missed his heart during the initial injury and decided now, today, to remind him that it was still there. The trauma surgery team had been waiting for him. The chart came across Natalie's desk at 7:42 a.m., and she didn't react. She didn't blink. She just read the name twice. Marcus Webb. Captain. United States Navy. Commanding Officer, Naval Special Warfare Group. The same officer who had written letters to her son. Natalie had watched those letters arrive at their apartment over the past 2 years, thick envelopes with official seals, words like exceptional leadership and steady under fire and the kind of sailor who makes you believe in the service. Her son, Marcus Jr., had read them aloud at the dinner table, and she'd listened with her hand steady on her fork, knowing that this man had shaped her boy into something she'd already lost when she signed the separation papers 8 years ago. Now that man was upstairs, scheduled for surgical exploration in 18 hours, and the cardiac surgeons were handling his case, not her. She was just the nurse who monitored vitals and changed 4 bags and kept her past buried so deep that even the monitors couldn't read it. She didn't volunteer for his floor. The charge nurse assigned her anyway. The shift began normally. Captain Webb was in ICU bed 7, still medicated, stable enough. His chest was wrapped in surgical bandaging that rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. The monitors glowed their green affirmations: blood pressure 120/78, heart rate 86, oxygen saturation 98% on supplemental air. The bandages smelled of betadine and fresh gauze. Everything was textbook. Everything was safe. 18 hours before his scheduled surgery, Natalie was doing a routine monitor check at 6:15 p.m. when the numbers started lying. Blood pressure 90/60. That wasn't alarming by itself. But the trend was wrong. The downward slope. She watched it drop as she stood there, 88/59. 84/55. The jugular veins above his collarbone had swollen to the thickness of a man's thumb, and his heart sounds came through the stethoscope muffled, distant, like someone speaking through an underwater wall. Muffled heart sounds meant fluid. Distended neck veins meant pressure. Dropping blood pressure meant his heart was running out of room inside his own chest. Cardiac tamponade. The shrapnel had shifted. The pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding his heart, was filling with blood, crushing the organ with every beat, slowly asphyxiating the ventricles until they could no longer push blood anywhere. 90 seconds from now, his pressure would drop below sustainable levels. 2 minutes from now, his heart would stop entirely. 3 minutes from now, he would be dead. Natalie hit the code button without hesitation. The pericardiocentesis kit was on the crash cart, right where it was supposed to be, the 18-gauge needle gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the collection syringe, the tubing for the cardiac monitor. She'd trained on this procedure 100 times, performed it in simulation, understood the anatomy like she understood her own hands. Below the xiphoid process. 45-degree angle. Advance slowly. Watch the ECG for ST elevation, the signal that you've touched the myocardium and need to pull back 1 mm. Don't perforate the chamber. Don't miss the sac. The on-call resident arrived 30 seconds later, fresh out of residency, still carrying the look of someone who believed that following the protocols would keep everyone alive. He saw the pressure readings, now at 74/40, and the color drained from his face like someone pulling a plug. "We need to wait for Hargrove," he stammered. His voice cracked on the second word. "The attending. He needs to authorize." "Webb's pressure is in the 60s, Natalie said." Her voice was flat, conversational, the tone of someone ordering coffee. Jugular veins distended. Muffled heart sounds. Cardiac tamponade confirmed. "We have 90 seconds before cardiac arrest." The resident's hands trembled as he reached for the phone. "I should call." "You can call while I work." She prepped the site with antiseptic in 3 swift motions, betadine swabbed across the lower sternum, alcohol swab to dry it, the sharp smell of chemical cleanliness cutting through the ambient hospital air. The needle felt like an extension of her fingers. Her hands were rock steady, the kind of steady that comes from having threaded full lines in blackened convoy trucks with incoming fire close enough to taste, from having performed emergency interventions in field hospitals where the only difference between correct and dead was the firmness of your grip. She positioned the needle below the xiphoid process and advanced at 45 degrees, watching the cardiac monitor, feeling the tissue resistance change as the needle penetrated the skin, then muscle, then the pericardial membrane. The ECG spiked, ST elevation, the warning sign. She pulled back 1 mm and aspirated. The syringe filled with blood. Dark, arterial blood that shouldn't be anywhere near the heart's outer surface. 18 milliliters. 20 milliliters. 22. She withdrew the needle as the last drops of blood drained from the pericardial space, and Webb's blood pressure climbed like a man surfacing from underwater. 100/65. The monitors stabilized. The muffled heart sounds cleared. Webb's oxygen saturation crept back up to 98. The resident exhaled so hard his shoulders sagged, and he slumped against the wall behind the bed, eyes closed, processing the fact that he'd just watched someone save a man's life in 90 seconds. But Dr. Hargrove arrived 4 minutes later. He stood in the doorway of Bay 7 with his arms crossed, observing the scene, the empty syringe on the crash cart, the cardiac monitor with its restored vitals, Natalie standing with her hands at her sides. His face went cold. Not angry. Cold. The kind of cold that made the room temperature drop, that transformed a man's features into something carved from stone. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice moved like a blade through air, precise and sharp. The resident pointed at Natalie. He wasn't experienced enough yet to understand that he was about to watch something break. "She saved his life, doctor." He was crashing. The pericardial sac was. Hargrove cut him off with a gesture. "I'm aware of the diagnosis, doctor. I'm asking who made the decision to perform an invasive procedure on my patient without consulting the attending surgeon." Natalie didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain. She didn't ask permission or apologize for the fact that she'd just prevented a man from dying. She said, "Captain Webb's vitals were unsustainable. The procedure was indicated. The procedure was performed. Captain Webb is stable." There was nothing deferential in her tone. There was nothing requesting or defensive. She'd spoken like someone giving a situation report, the way a soldier delivers facts to a commanding officer. For a moment, something flickered across Hargrove's face, confusion, maybe, or the first recognition that something was very wrong with his understanding of who this nurse actually was. Then his expression settled back into contempt. "You just ended your career, sweetheart," he said quietly. He turned and walked out of the bay. The resident didn't move. Captain Webb lay unconscious, his heart no longer drowning in its own blood, oblivious to the fact that his reprieve had just purchased his nurse a one-way exit from the hospital. By 7:43 a.m. the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the Portland skyline, a formal complaint had been filed with the hospital's medical board. Practicing beyond her scope. Failure to wait for attending authorization. The document was 18 pages. Hargrove had been thorough. The document was 18 pages. Hargrove had been thorough. But what he didn't understand was that Natalie had spent 12 years filing incident reports in Kandahar province, where every word could cost lives. She read his complaint once. Then she set it down on her kitchen counter, made coffee, and waited. The phone call started at 7 in the morning. Hargrove moved with the precision of a man who understood institutional architecture the way a sniper understands sightlines. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply activated the network he'd spent 23 years building, one favor at a time, one colleague at a time, one strategic dinner at a time. His first call went to the hospital board chairman, a man named Sterling who'd been in medical school with Hargrove back when they both believed power was something you accumulated like real estate. Sterling owed him. Everyone owed him something. "We have a situation," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as surgical steel. "One of our nurses, acting beyond her scope, performed an emergency procedure without physician oversight. Cardiac intervention. I'm concerned about liability. Patient safety. The usual vectors." Sterling listened. Of course he listened. That was the architecture of institutional power. The phone call itself was the threat. The details were decoration. Within 2 hours, Hargrove contacted the references from Natalie's sparse employment file. A nursing supervisor from a private clinic in Virginia. A retired colonel from Walter Reed Medical Center. He didn't ask them directly about Natalie. He planted uncertainty instead. "We're conducting a competency investigation," he said to each one. "Nothing concrete yet. But in your experience, did you notice any patterns of overreach? Boundary issues? Acting outside her training?" The retired colonel paused. "Natalie Hayes? No. That woman was the most competent medic I ever worked with." "Why?" Hargrove smiled into the phone. The colonel didn't need to say yes. He only needed to say something, anything, that created a seed of doubt. Doubt spread. Doubt metastasized. Doubt was his actual weapon. By afternoon, he'd brought in the hospital's quality assurance team, 2 investigators with clipboards and expressions that suggested they'd already decided on guilt. They had files now. 18 pages of complaint. 3 years of procedures to audit. They went through Natalie's patient records like archaeologists looking for buried evidence, pulling cases, documenting every intervention, every note, every decision made under pressure when the on-call resident was frozen and Captain Webb's pericardial sac was filling with blood. The hospital's administrative machinery moved with terrifying efficiency. It moved like something designed specifically to crush people who didn't have lawyers, or connections, or the kind of institutional power that came with an MD and a parking spot near the executive entrance. Natalie didn't fight it. She called the HR department at 11 in the morning and asked when they wanted to meet. The director, a woman named Patricia whose hand shook when she handed over the suspension letter, couldn't meet her eyes. "Pending the investigation's findings, you're being suspended effective immediately. Your badge access is being revoked. Security will escort you from the building." Natalie took the letter. 3 pages. Official letterhead. The weight of institutional authority bound in a manila folder. The security guard who walked her to her locker was the same man who'd smiled at her every morning for 3 years. His name was Curtis. He had a daughter in college. Natalie had asked about her test scores 6 months ago. Now Curtis carried a cardboard box, her personal items, the photo of Marcus Jr. in his Navy prep uniform, her spare scrubs, and wouldn't look at her face. They walked past the nurse's station. 300 eyes didn't follow her. The room was so carefully not watching that it was the loudest silence Natalie had ever heard. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone dropped a pen. It hit tile with a sound like a gunshot in a cathedral. Dr. Hargrove stood at his office window on the 3rd floor. Natalie saw him when Curtis walked her to the main entrance. Hargrove's arms were crossed. His expression was satisfaction wearing the shape of professionalism. He'd broken something that refused to break easily, and that refusal had made breaking it more important than anything else in his world. Natalie drove home in silence. She set the cardboard box by her apartment door and sat on the floor next to it. The apartment was quiet in a way that meant nothing. 12 years of military service had trained her to hear silence as information. This silence said, "You are alone." This silence said, "You chose this." This silence said, "The thing you ran from caught up with you anyway." She'd left the Navy after Kandahar. After 3 years of holding dying sailors while helicopter rotors shook the walls of the field hospital. After watching a 22-year-old petty officer code twice and recover twice and then not recover the 3rd time. After her own psychiatric evaluation had concluded, unfit for continued combat operations. Recommend medical discharge. But she'd negotiated. No medical discharge. No publicity. Just a quiet separation and a DD-214 form that said she'd served with distinction, as if distinction mattered when your hands still felt like they were holding someone else's blood. She'd come to Portland to disappear. To be nobody. To work in a hospital where nobody knew her name, where she could help people during the daylight and sit alone at night without the nightmares quite so loud. She'd built that small refuge over 3 years, brick by brick, day by day. And now it was gone in 48 hours. 2 days later, she sat in the VA hospital waiting room. The appointment she'd postponed for months was finally happening. A psychiatric evaluation. The thing she'd been running from since Kandahar. The waiting room smelled like industrial coffee and the particular staleness of fluorescent air. Veterans filled the plastic chairs. A man with a prosthetic arm. An older woman with a scar along her temple. A young kid, couldn't have been more than 23, whose hands trembled as he held a form. Natalie recognized the hollow stare in their eyes. The way they sat like people who'd already survived the worst and were waiting to see what the universe wanted to take next. She sat among them, clipboard in her lap, her own intake form half filled. The question asked about service-related trauma. The question asked about coping mechanisms. The question asked, how many days in the past 2 weeks have you thought about harming yourself? Natalie looked around the room. Every single person in here had already answered that question in their own way. They were still here. Still waiting. Still trying. The kid with the trembling hands was still holding the pen. She filled in her answers. 20 years of service. 3 tours. Combat medic. Witness multiple casualties under hostile fire. Experiencing recurring nightmares. Difficulty with trust. Loss of employment due to investigation. The door at the back of the waiting room opened. A voice called a name. An older veteran stood, folded his newspaper, and walked toward the door like a man moving toward something he'd been waiting for. Natalie was still sitting in the plastic chair when she heard the commotion at Mercy General. The call came through on the local news at 4:47 in the afternoon. Something about the hospital administrator calling an emergency board meeting. Something about an investigation into the senior surgeon's conduct. The details were vague, but the speed was unmistakable. Institutional machinery was moving in reverse. Toward something. Or away from something. But Natalie didn't know that yet. She was still in the waiting room, still waiting for her name to be called, still recognizing in the mirror of every veteran's eyes the thing she saw in her own reflection every morning. The hollow place where hope used to live. The doors burst open at 2:33 p.m. on a Tuesday, and Marcus Jr. didn't knock. He crashed through the conference room like a man who'd learned urgency from watching his mother work Code Blues. The hospital administrator's termination hearing froze mid-sentence. Board members looked up from their leather folders. And there stood Natalie's son, 17 years old, holding a cardboard showbox like it contained the answers to questions nobody had asked yet. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, breathing hard, his voice carrying the same controlled precision she'd taught him without ever explaining why. He didn't ask permission. He didn't apologize for interrupting. He upended the showbox across the mahogany conference table, and medals scattered like coins at a wishing well. Bronze star. Silver star. 2 purple hearts. And then the Navy Cross caught the fluorescent light and held it, refracting gold across the polished wood. The room didn't just go silent. The room held its breath. Natalie sat in the defendant's chair, watching her son's hand shake with the effort of keeping his voice steady as he read from a crumpled piece of paper. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Group. No one spoke. The nursing director's pen fell from her fingers and clattered against the floor, a small sound that felt like thunder in the stillness. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the table's edge hard enough that his knuckles turned white, and for the first time in 3 years of knowing him, Natalie saw something crack in his composure. Fear, maybe. Or the recognition of ground shifting beneath him. Then the monitor on the wall flickered to life. Captain Marcus Webb appeared on the screen from his hospital bed, still pale, still tethered to machines, but upright. Alive. His voice came through steady and clear, the voice of a man who'd commanded SEALs through 3-hour firefights in the Sanjin Valley. "That bronze star is from Operation Enduring Freedom, 2012, Forward Operating Base Shank," Webb said, pointing at the screen. "That silver star is from Kandahar, March 2013. She was attached to Charlie Platoon during a direct action raid. 12 of us went in. 12 of us came back because of her." He paused, and his eyes glistened. "I've been searching for her for 3 years. For states. Every medical database. Every hospital staff directory. All I had was a faded unit patch she'd sewn inside her jacket lining, the only thing she left behind when she disappeared. I found that patch in my rucksack 2 years after Kandahar. Kept it all this time." The board chairman leaned forward. "Captain, you're saying you knew her?" "I'm saying she saved my life. 3 years ago, I didn't know where she was. Now I do. And I'm not the only one who owed her a debt." The nursing director reached across the table with trembling hands, not fear, Natalie could see, but reverence, and lifted a commendation from the scattered medals. She read aloud, her voice wavering, in recognition of heroic service during combat operations in Kandahar province. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes provided emergency medical intervention under direct fire, treating 12 personnel for penetrating trauma while exposed to effective enemy small arms and explosive ordnance. Her actions prevented 3 fatalities and resulted in full recovery of all personnel. And then a man in a Navy dress uniform appeared in the conference room doorway, a SEAL liaison, his bearing unmistakable, his presence making the air pressure change. He held a folder marked classified across its cover. "The Navy Cross isn't her highest decoration," he said quietly. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes was recommended for the Medal of Honor following Operation Mountain Storm in 2014. That recommendation remains classified. But I can tell you this, the woman sitting in that chair held the line when 12 other soldiers couldn't. She did it without a weapon. She did it with her hands and her training and a refusal to watch people die. Dr. Hargrove stood. His chair scraped backward against the tile floor, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed through the room like a gunshot. He straightened his tie. His face had gone the color of old bone. "This is a farce," he said. "I'm leaving." The security guard, the same man who'd carried Natalie's belongings in cardboard boxes 3 days earlier, stepped forward and held out a box identical to the one that had contained her life at Mercy General. His expression didn't change. His voice didn't rise. "I believe you know the way out, sir," he said. The board chairman's voice followed, ice-cold and final. "Your hospital privileges are revoked effective immediately, Dr. Hargrove. Your board positions are terminated. We'll be notifying the National Practitioner Data Bank of our findings. You can expect contact from our legal team regarding the wrongful termination suit." Hargrove left without collecting the box. The silence after he vanished felt like a held breath finally released. Natalie stood. Captain Webb rendered a salute from his hospital bed, hand to temple, eyes locked on hers. Marcus Jr. looked at his mother with the kind of pride that only comes from understanding what someone has survived. The nursing director held the Navy Cross out toward Natalie like an offering, like an apology, like recognition of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. "Welcome home, Senior Chief," the director whispered. 6 months later, autumn rain hammered Portland like applause, and Natalie stood at her reflection in the coffee shop window. She wore her dress whites for the first time in 4 years, the uniform crisp, the creases sharp enough to cut, the unit patch now visible on her sleeve instead of hidden. Across the street, through the rain-streaked glass, she saw Dr. Hargrove at a folding table beneath a strip mall awning. Insurance company banner overhead. Pamphlets arranged in neat rows. A man in business casual handing flyers to people who wouldn't meet his eyes, who took the papers and didn't look back. He looked smaller than she remembered. Diminished, like his authority had been a weight he'd carried and finally set down, and now his shoulders couldn't remember how to hold themselves without it. Natalie didn't feel triumph. She felt acknowledgement, the quiet recognition that some things correct themselves without requiring justice. Sometimes gravity is enough. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Jr. texting a photo from the commissioning ceremony that started in 90 minutes. She was the guest of honor. The text read, "Captain Webb wants to do the pinning himself. He said you should know." She pocketed the phone and left her coffee untouched. The ceremony took place at Naval Station Newport, flags snapping in the salt ocean wind, the parade ground lined with dress uniforms standing rigid as monuments. Marcus Jr. stood at attention in his ensign whites, his expression a perfect blend of focus and barely contained emotion, exactly like his mother's. Captain Webb approached from the side, his own chest bearing the faint scar from the pericardiocentesis needle that had saved his life. When he pinned the ensign's bars onto Marcus Jr.'s shoulders, his hands were absolutely steady. When the ceremony concluded, both men, the captain and the young ensign, rendered a salute directed at Natalie standing in the front row. Not the ceremonial kind. The sharp, precise kind that meant respect earned rather than given. She returned it, hand steady, decades of training moving through muscle memory like water finding its path. The tremor that had haunted her for 4 years was finally gone. Webb approached her afterward, shook her hand with both of his. His grip was firm, genuine, the grip of a man who'd spent 3 years searching for someone and finally found her. 3 years I looked for you, he said. I knew you were out there somewhere. Still saving lives. Still refusing to let people die on your watch. She smiled, and it felt like something breaking open inside her chest, not pain, but healing. Just doing what I was trained to do, sir. That evening, Natalie returned to Mercy General, not as a defendant but as the newly appointed Director of Trauma Services. The nursing director had made the offer herself, had built it with the board's unanimous approval and a significant salary adjustment. Natalie walked past the ICU where everything had changed, saw the night shift nurses at their station, and remembered what invisibility felt like. She remembered being small, being quiet, being dismissed. She would not let them forget her again. In the break room, she hung her white coat on a hook, her name embroidered above the title Director of Trauma Services, and beneath it, barely visible, the faded unit patch from Kandahar. It had survived everything, 3 tours, the weight of holding dying soldiers, the years of hiding, the humiliation, the betrayal, the vindication. It was still there. Still bearing witness. The hospital hummed around her, monitors beeping in distant rooms, the ventilators breathing their mechanical rhythms, the quiet determination of nurses moving through their shifts, invisible and essential and holding the line. She thought of the 12 people she'd saved in that firefight. The 12 people the board would never know about. The countless others whose names she'd never learned but whose lives had changed because she'd been trained, because she'd refused to break, because she'd walked away from a uniform but never from the oath. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. There are more stories coming, more people whose strength survived in the quiet places. Like this video and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What would you have done in Natalie's position?